everybody. I guess I'm live. Everybody can hear me? Yay, thank you. I think we'll get started. My name is Kristina Bross. I'm professor of English, and I'm the Associate Dean of Research and Creative Endeavors in the Honors College. And it's my happy duty today to facilitate this discussion. I want to thank a couple of people, and then we'll do some introductions, and we'll get right into the discussion. This panel comes about as part of the English department's Big Read program, where we choose a book and we think about it in all kinds of different ways over the course of the year. I want to thank Professor Derek Pacheco, who's here in the third row, who has taken the lead on this program and invited so many of you here today. Big welcome to all of the high school students who are attending Dawn or Doom today. We're really pleased to see you. I also want to thank the West Lafayette Public Library, which has been a key partner in the Big Read, and the Honors College, which is co-sponsoring this panel. Here's the setup today. We're going to do a few introductions, and then we're going to read a passage of the Underground Railroad out loud so that everybody in this room is on the same page, whether you've read the book or not. And then we'll turn to our panelists, and we have faculty from several disciplines here, who I'll introduce in just a moment, who've been asked 3 questions about this passage. First, what do you hear or what do you see in the passage? Second, and thinking from your own disciplinary perspective, what do you hear, what do you see? Second, what kinds of questions does it cause you to ask? And third, what do you do with those questions? How might you go about answering them, or what might be the next steps to come out of them? And so I have a little mini assignment for everybody in this room, which is when we read the passage, think about that first question. What pops out to you? What's the word, the phrase, the idea, the thing that seems most important to you in that passage? Sort of keep that in your head as we go into the discussion. Let me do some introductions here. So to my right is Dr. Zahra Tehrani, who is clinical assistant professor in the Honors College. She teaches courses on stem cells this semester and CRISPR, that's next semester's class, and looks at media hype and biotechnology and its effects on public trust. She's published research in the areas of molecular, cellular, and developmental biology, and her current research focuses on best practices for teaching scientific literacy in undergraduate education. Dr. Jennifer Freeman Marshall is an associate professor of English and Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies, and she is the director of the Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies program here at Purdue. Her published work focuses on African American literature, in particular the works both literary and anthropological of Zora Neale Hurston. She enjoys reading sci-fi, including the works of Octavia Butler, and she encourages all of you to read her works as well. I second that. Dr. Frank Dooley is professor of agricultural economics and senior vice provost for teaching and learning. His work concerns issues in the food manufacturing and retailing, ethanol, transportation, country grain elevator industries. He is an avid reader, and I know this for a fact, of a wide variety of fiction and nonfiction, and always looking for a good read. And I think our book today, well, the title, or the cover image is up there, is one of those good reads. We are really especially pleased to be able to bring literary studies into the Dawn or Doom conference as a kind of different way to think about technology and its effects on society. Okay, to the passage. Oh, before I go, I want to introduce the students who've been helping us and who are going to be reading the passage for us today. Let's see, who's first? Melissa? Melissa Robbins is she's majoring in bioengineering and is in the Honors College. Karanda Harris is majoring in professional writing, also in the Honors College. And Parith Madapalli is also in the Honors College and majoring in electrical engineering. So let's get to the passage. Oops. Oh wait, I want to go back one bit. The context for this, the reason we chose the passage, which is a moment where the main characters, Cora and her friends, are discussing what's happening in South Carolina. The book is set up so that each chapter, each section is a stop on the Underground Railroad, and we're following the experiences of Cora as she leaves slavery and tries to find freedom. When they arrive in South Carolina, they think they found a very good place to be. They're fed, they're clothed, they're housed, they have jobs. But what they find out is that the entire community has been given over to an experiment in eugenics, forced sterilization, medical experimentation without the permission of the subjects. And the passage we're going to read is when they're talking about this discovery and what to make of it. One of the reasons we chose it is that it connects to our own state history. In 1907, Indiana became the first state to pass legislation that allowed for forced sterilization of those that the state deemed undesirable people. And you can see the historical marker, which is down in Indianapolis, that the State Historical Society put up a few years ago. Okay, so that's the context. And here we go. All right.
The doctor leaned in.
Oops. Hold on, do we need the mic here turned on?
And loud.
Maybe we need to pull it out. There we go.
The doctor leaned in. Had Sam read the newspaper today? Sam shook his head and topped off the man's drink. Still, the barkeep must have seen the editorials over the years, the doctor insisted, expressing anxiety over this very topic. America has imported and bred so many Africans that in many states the whites are outnumbered. For that reason alone, emancipation is impossible. With strategic sterilization, first the women, but both sexes in time, we could free them from bondage without fear that they'd butcher us in our sleep. The architects of the Jamaica uprisings had been of Beninese and Congolese extraction, willful and cunning. What if we tempered those bloodlines carefully over time? The data collected on the colored pilgrims and their descendants over years and decades, the doctor said, will prove one of the boldest scientific enterprises in history. Controlled sterilization, research into communicable diseases, the perfection of new surgical techniques on the socially unfit. Was it any wonder the best medical talents in the country were flocking to South Carolina?
A group of rowdies stumbled in and crowded Bertram to the end of the bar. Sam was occupied. The doctor drank quietly for a time and then slipped out. "You two are not the sort that goes to Red's," Sam said, "but I wanted you to know." "Red's," Cora said. "This is more than the saloon, Sam. We have to tell them that they're being lied to. They're sick. Caesar was in agreement." "Will they believe you over their white doctor?" Sam asked. "With what proof? There is no authority to turn for redress. The town is paying for it all. And then there are all the other towns where colored pilgrims have been installed in the same system. This is not the only place with a new hospital." They worked it out over the kitchen table. Was it possible that not only the doctors, but everyone who ministered to the colored population was involved in this incredible scheme, steering the colored pilgrims down this or that path, buying them from estates in the block in order to conduct this experiment? All those white hands working in concert, committing their facts and figures down on blue paper.
After Cora's discussion with Dr. Stevens, Miss Lucy had stopped her one morning on her way to the museum. Had Cora given any thought to the hospital's birth control program? Perhaps Cora could talk to some of the other girls about it, in words they could understand. It would be very appreciated, the white woman said. There were all sorts of new positions opening up in town, opportunities for people who had proven their worth. Cora thought back to the night she and Caesar decided to stay, the screaming woman who wandered into the green when the social came to an end. "They're taking away my babies." The woman wasn't lamenting an old plantation injustice, but a crime perpetrated here in South Carolina. The doctors were stealing her babies from her, not her former masters. "They wanted to know what part of Africa my parents hailed from," Caesar said. "How was I to know? He said I had the nose of a Beninese. Nothing like flattery before they gelled a fellow," Sam said.
Thanks, everybody. Okay, that's the passage. So we're just going to start with our very first question for each of our panelists. Sorry. What is it that you see or hear when you first encounter this?
So the first thing that came to my mind when I read this passage was the parallels in the language and discussions that are taking place right now in the scientific community with regards to human gene editing and how this could open up potentially a Pandora's box for modern day eugenics. So before I get into that, I wanted to first give a brief history of how the idea of eugenics came about. So the term eugenics literally in Greek means good birth or well-born. And it was a term that was coined by British scientists in 1869, just a few years after Gregory Mendel, who many of you have probably heard about in your biology courses. He's considered the father of genetics, and he published his work demonstrating the principles of inheritance in 1865. And it was really these early geneticists who embraced Mendel's work and said, hey, let's take these principles that Mendel discusses, and let's apply it to humans. And let's see if we can improve the human gene pool and create this more fit human species by applying these principles. So the approach was to control human mating patterns, just like how animal breeders had been doing with livestock for centuries, just like how Mendel had been doing with his pea plants. And so the idea was that you selectively breed for desirable traits, however that's defined by society, and sterilize those with undesirable traits, such as people with a criminal history, alcoholism, poverty, mental disabilities, physical disabilities. Okay, and so if we just look at it through a scientific lens, strictly speaking, putting the ethical issues, the many ethical issues aside, and we just look at it scientifically, there are many problems with eugenics. Right? And the main problem is that it assumes that our traits, all of our traits, are purely genetic. And we know that today, we know that that's not the case, right? There is no single gene that you can map back to for aggression or for physical disabilities or mental disabilities, right? Actually, most of our traits are not, cannot be mapped back to a single gene. I mean, some traits can be like, baldness or color blindness and so forth, but most of the traits that these eugenic researchers were trying to weed out of the human gene pool or the human population were traits that either don't have any genetic basis, you can't map it back to a gene, or if they do have a genetic basis, they don't follow a predictable pattern of inheritance. In other words, they don't follow Mendelian inheritance, okay? And the reason for this is because most of our traits are complex traits. So what that means is that they are controlled by multiple genes. Some of those genes we still don't know. And whether or not these traits develop or not depends on the environment. So that was the problem. They completely disregarded the role of the environment. And so with these complex traits like, physical disabilities, mental illnesses, because they didn't take into consideration the environmental factors like poor nutrition or inadequate education, it just didn't work, right? But so that sets the stage of how eugenics came about. Now, these ideas of eliminating unwanted genes is very relevant today. It still persists today with genetic testing of pregnant women for Down syndrome or for physical abnormalities, right? And with the CRISPR craze that's going on right now in the scientific community. So for those of you, many of you probably heard about CRISPR. It's a hot topic in science news. But for those of you who don't know what CRISPR is about, basically it's this enzyme that's found endogenously, it's found natively in bacteria. And a few years ago, a group in Berkeley said, hey, why don't we use this enzyme as a tool to edit and snip DNA wherever we want and potentially edit out genes, defective genes, right? Now this technology, DNA editing technology, has been around for decades. It's nothing new. What makes CRISPR so exciting and cool is that it's so easy to do and it's so precise and efficient and cheap. Okay, so you can get a CRISPR kit for less than $50 today. And it's not that complicated to carry out. So it's important to have this discussion right now because last year, for the first time, 3 groups around the world, including in the US, used CRISPR for the first time in human embryos. And the idea was to edit out defective genes, genes that are associated with specific diseases, and potentially replace them with normal copies. It didn't result in any live births. It was just for research purposes. But there are parallels with this passage and the language that the doctor uses with language that we're seeing among scientists. Just to go back to this passage here, the doctor right before this passage begins, the doctor describes sterilization programs sort of like as if it's a public health intervention program, right? He says it will protect women and children from the jungle urges, as he puts it, of the slaves, right? And he describes it as this bold scientific enterprise. And likewise, we're seeing very similar verbiage coming from scientists in the area of gene editing, human gene editing. And I just pulled a quote from the International Summit on Human Gene Editing this past summer. One of the speakers said, "We have a moral responsibility to protect future generations from the transmission of genetic diseases." And so this opens up the question of, well, is the eradication of disease eugenics or not?
Thanks. Yeah, wonderful. Thank you. Let's see. Want me to go back, or are you?
Yeah, I'm really interested in the passage where Cora and her friends are sort of wondering, could this really be happening? Could all of these sort of different people come together and work systematically to, in this effort to not only eliminate unwanted genes, as you've described for us here, but literally to eliminate, in many ways, unwanted people. I'm thinking about, my interest is focusing on Cora's subjectivity and how she's representative of women and marginalized communities. And then thinking about the way in which this passage and that sort of larger section obviously makes reference to the Tuskegee experiment, the Tuskegee syphilis experiment, which I don't know how many of you all maybe covered this to provide a kind of historical context for understanding what's happening in this particular chapter. But that experiment began around 1919, 1920, and went on for roughly about 40 years, wherein groups of African Americans, particularly African American men, were not treated once they were diagnosed with syphilis, but were not treated, even though at some point around 1940, there was a treatment available for syphilis in terms of penicillin. So instead of treating those communities, the scientists observed the effects of syphilis on their bodies. And that meant that they went unprotected, but also all of their families, their partners, their children potentially went untreated as well. So that question, could it be that all of these people could sort of come together? The parallel that I see is in that historical moment. And it raises an interesting question about bioethics, which is not in my sort of area of specialization, but I want to, obviously raise that. The other thing that's really interesting to me about this passage, and this is where I'll sort of bring in other backgrounds that I have. At one point, I did research in medical anthropology, looking at individuals' health-seeking behavior, the kinds of beliefs and attitudes and practices that inform the choices that we all make in terms of whether to seek health care or to not seek health care when we're presented with certain kinds of signs or symptoms of an illness. And so by extension, I guess, to come back to that passage, which is, could it be, that question sort of being raised in this fictional context is a real question that's raised in many cultural contexts where the lore, the reality, the fact of the syphilis experiment, the Tuskegee syphilis experiment, has informed the folklore of so many communities so that it creates a real barrier today for individuals to seek health care, to trust their physicians, to trust the medical system. And so I guess I'll just pause there to think about the way in which we might continue to think about as new technologies are created in the name of science, the real human impact that it has, and quite frankly, technologies are only as good as the people who are applying them.
Thanks, Chris. So I look at my colleagues on the stage, and I go, so I'm an agricultural economist, and you're probably wondering, did they make a mistake, or did she invite the wrong person? But I do, Chris and I have traveled, and we both love to read, and this book for me was really hard to read. I mean, it's wonderfully written, but it's a really hard story. And I, as you read it, I hope you struggled as much as I did, because they do an amazing job of, you're bringing the story forward over 100 years, 150 years, and it's still relevant today, right? And so I will pull my disciplinary perspective. So an agricultural economist is really an economist who focuses on agricultural issues, if you would. And I spent a lot of time teaching, freshmen microeconomics. And the parallel that I'll draw here is when we teach econ, we come to this belief, people walk out of most of their econ courses believing that pure competition is the best thing in the world. And that's chapter 5. And most econ books have another 15 chapters where they talk, economics breaks down. And we end up with monopolies and all kinds of things. There is a role for government there. And most of the time we forget that part. We end at chapter 5, we create this thing that there's this institution. And that's what I pull out of this part of the book, is that we've kind of cloaked ourselves with it. Well, it's in a hospital, and there's people wearing white coats, and it must be, so we give ourselves the illusion. So the doctors and the community in South Carolina, the white community, said, oh, we're doing this with the best of intentions for the world. We're thinking it benevolently, if we would. But yet when you look at the things that they did, you just want to shake it. And that's why the book's so hard, because you run, what could they possibly be thinking was justifiable in their actions? So that's why I say it's hard, because you look at, and where it's hard to me is you go back in history, you can always tell yourself, well, they didn't know as much as we know today. So fast forward, we know a lot more today, but we still see lots of injustice. And I start, so if you go dawn or doom, and most economists are going to be doomed, so give me that. But at the end of the day, you see how hard we struggle as a society to come to grip with these issues. And that's why I find it a hard read, that the progress that we want to see just seems to be so hard to get. Will we ever get there?
Thanks. Okay, so our next question was, what questions come out of your observations? And I was listening to you all. I thought I heard, of course, we're going to have to talk about the ethics, right? So certainly we hope that any scientist, anybody working on technology is going to be thinking ethically, but we know that that's not always possible, not always the case. So one of the things that I think this book does so extraordinarily well is, as you're all suggesting, forces us to think about what are good intentions, and where do they go once they sort of are launched into the world. The question that arose for me as I listened to you all is, if this program of sterilization, of medical experimentation, is understood by the people who are perpetrating it as noble in some way, and back to, let's see, I think it's right at the beginning, this phrase, the doctor said, this will prove one of the boldest scientific enterprises in history. You can, if you sort of jump over some of the language in there, as Dr. Tehrani suggested, it's language that we still are employing today. This is going to be a great breakthrough. This is going to protect people. This is going to help future generations. And the question then is, which people is it going to protect? Which children are going to be given access to the findings? And who's going to be sort of used up along the way in order to get there? So that's one of the questions that came to me as I listened to you. But what other questions kind of arise for you as you think about what you first saw? And anybody can answer at this point.
For me, going back to the question that I stated earlier, is the editing out and elimination of disease, is that a good thing necessarily? I mean, how do you define what is a disease? Are certain disabilities like deafness, for example, is that a disease? should that be edited out? Because if you ask people in the community, the disabilities community, they would argue that no, their disability is actually adding to the diversity of life. And that instead of editing it out, we should accommodate those disabilities and improve their well-being. And so it just raised this question of like, once we get to that point where we say, okay, we are going to open this to the public and allow people to do IVF and edit certain genes, where do we draw the line? Where do we draw the line between disease and just pure enhancement? You know, I want to increase muscle mass. I want to make my child, you know, have blue color eyes or green color eyes, you know, so where do we draw that line?
The questions that I raise are, I suppose, within the larger context of this novel. So we've been given this very, you know, really intense, relatively short passage to consider and to do a close reading of, right? Paying attention to the conversations that people are having with each other, that very particular setting. I think it's helpful for me to step back from the passage and to ask, so where is Cora coming from? What are the kinds of assumptions that she has? Obviously, she's made it out of slavery, or so she hopes, right? She's, you know, one sort of state away. She's just made it through this fantastical, or experienced this fantastical underground railroad trip that has all of these sort of wonderful illusions that we're trying to sort of make sense of. It's still a bit of a puzzle. And when she emerges out of the Underground Railroad into South Carolina for the first time, after having come from this agricultural space, this very rural location where she's experiencing slavery, and where we've got to have a general sense that the kind of slavery that she's experienced is different from the kind of slavery that her companion has experienced. So already the idea of the complexity of the institution of slavery has already been drawn out for us really nicely. And so as readers, you know, imagining that first time that you read the book, first time I read the book, what's going to happen when she emerges out of this Underground Railroad that's literally a, you know, it's a subway of sorts. And she sees that skyscraper for the first time and realizes, oh, you know, we're someplace else, and this isn't quite where I imagined I would be. So I think the question, to sort of circle back to this question, the question that I'm curious about is, what is that juxtaposition intended to signal to us? The expectation that she's in a modern space, a space that might offer something very different. The rest of that narrative in that chapter, of course, and in subsequent chapters, teases out this idea that they're in a much more sophisticated modern location that's going to offer sort of every possibility to this group of people. And so I think the question for me is, why the juxtaposition, and what, I have an answer, I think, but I'm going to hold the question. Why the juxtaposition between those two locations, and what are we as readers supposed to understand about that juxtaposition for what that location promises to Cora? And you've already mentioned that. You noted that in your introduction, I might add, but I think that's the question that I would.
And for people who haven't read the book, and I don't, this is no spoiler, one of the things that's really interesting, I think, is that it jumps time and space. It jumps space because she's moving, but it jumps time. I see some nods up there.
Right.
So this chapter, the South Carolina chapter, is really alternative history, if we want to use that generic term, and Whitehead is bringing in, you know, later history and applying it to this earlier moment, which is one of the ways I think that he invites us to extend our perspective to the present day by moving back and forth through our received history. I think he causes us to ask, well, what does this mean now? At least I hope that's.
Yeah, well, I mean, it actually jumps time, space, and people.
And people, yeah.
Right, and I guess what I was going to say is that when I look at it, I think what we always are seeking is the notion of hope, right? And I mean, her upbringing, it was brutal, right? And I mean, there's no other way to say the brutality of slavery, that the way he tells the story and what she experienced as a young girl, you just you go, that can't be true, but you know, it was, right? But still she had hope. And then her hopes get dashed over and over, but that persists. So if there's something in us as people and as humans, you know, earlier I said I'm a doom person, but there is this, I mean, the dawn depends upon hope, right? And I just, if that is part of what defines us and that allows us to push forward, because we're all going to run into days that aren't particularly good. We're all going to run into situations that, how do I overcome this? You know, there's the notion floating around about the importance of resilience and grit and determination. But I think if you flip them on their axis, they're actually hope. And so while I find these dark passages in the book, and they're dark to me because they're so true, and we haven't dealt with them, there is a notion of hope. So I think you have to read it, and I'm always the person looking for the happy ending, right? And you have to work pretty hard to get to that in this book, right?
Yeah. As we sort of segue to the last question that I asked the panelists to consider, we are going to leave time for questions from you all, and we very much hope to hear from lots of you. We've got 2 microphones, 1 on each side, and at this point, if any of you would like to pose a question to the panel to ask, or if you want to tell us what your one thing is that you heard or saw when we read the passage, I invite you to come and line up at this point. We'll sort of segue to our last question, and then we'll open up the floor to all of you. So I'm not seeing a dash for the microphones right now, but I'll give you a minute to kind of contemplate what you might want to ask. So I want to think a little bit here now about the things you saw, the questions it caused you to answer, and ask what would be the next step for you. And Zahra, you might not want to talk about this, but I know you said you imagine you're going to be bringing this book into your class next semester. And I'm really curious what you're hoping the students will do with it in a class that's about CRISPR and gene editing.
So I just want students to start thinking about, you know, should we proceed with this, or should we slow down and just simply have a discussion? Because things are progressing very quickly in the realm of CRISPR and human gene editing. And I don't know what the solution is, but I personally think that it might be a good idea to just, put a hold on things, just have simply a discussion between legislators, scientists, ethicists, the public, and really think about what are the implications of what we're doing? What are the consequences? And I just hope students reflect on this question in the audience and in my class.
Yeah, I think that, can you ask the final question again? Because I want to make sure I'm answering it directly. Yes.
Well, and you can take it the way you want to.
Okay.
But I guess we've said, here's what we see. Here are the kinds of questions.
Where do we go from here?
Where do we go from here? Or
Yeah.
even what's the answer to your
to that question?
The question about the text.
I want to come back to Cora, and Cora doesn't stay in South Carolina. Cora escapes. She expects that it will offer certain kinds of advantages to her, and that's tempting. It seduces both her and her travel companion. In fact, he stays too long, right? And so as much as we sort of think about resilience and being able to sort of have hope, which I 100% agree with, hope is necessary. There's also so much space here for self-care and for resistance, quite frankly. And given that Cora represents, in many ways, women and marginalized communities, it is a kind of warning to not rest easy, even if one is surrounded by the sort of comforts that a place like South Carolina might bring. And that, I think, is really the challenge that we're up against in our society. If you're privileged to have so many different comforts, right, that can really lull us into a sense of, well, I'm okay. I have great employment. In fact, Cora's tempted in that way. She's put on a pedestal. You represent the best and the brightest of your community, and we can use you to sort of get other people on board with this major public health campaign. So what's next is kind of maybe taking a page from Cora's book, literally, maybe figuratively, and thinking about how one might respond to that kind of dilemma. If you're faced with having to make a choice one way or the other between accepting the kind of status quo because it provides you with some creature comforts, or deciding that you're going to move along on your journey to freedom.
Greg, I'm going to give you a little time because now we do have people.
Well,
lined up,
yeah,
so.
no, that's good, and
Yeah.
I'll try to make this brief, but I mean, the other part, then I agree entirely with what you're saying. If you go outside the passage a little bit, though, where, and she is stood up as you're the ideal, right? You need to persuade the other girls to, come along with us. They view her as a role model. She is given privilege in South Carolina. But at the same time, if you go few pages before, she's part of an exhibit in a museum.
Mm-hmm.
So at the same time, we're trying to pull her up, push her right back down to remind you're not that good. And so that part to me is this, and she must have been so conflicted as to what, and I think you create this notion you want to believe it's going to be, because where you came from, it's got to be better. And I think and you look for the rose-colored glass, if you would, right? And then reality comes tumbling it down. But that's where, I want to say there's a lot of students in the room, and let me go back to the notion of hope. So I've been working with students for a long time. And if there's anything that gives me hope, is when I talk to the students of today, is you are much more aware of this story. So the folks of my generation, this is a story, now we wouldn't have read it, right? But the students today are reading the story, and you're much more open as to the acceptance of people for people. And if there's hope that I have, it's because of the students in the room.
Can I ask you to start? I think you were first up. Go ahead.
Okay. I was wondering if for the geneticist teacher, have you heard about what they're doing in Iceland? Basically, they've been doing genetic manipulation to basically remove all Down syndrome and disabilities from the gene pool. They've actually have basically removed Down syndrome permanently, because they've literally just had every single child who has shown signs of being someone with Down syndrome. They've just aborted them immediately.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I haven't heard about what's going on in Iceland, but even before CRISPR, we were technically editing or weeding out disease genes through PreImplantation genetic diagnosis. So basically, if you know a disease runs in your family, you can do in vitro fertilization and test each embryo to see which one doesn't carry that mutation, and that's the embryo you implant. So even before CRISPR, this has been going on. It's just that now we can, we can manipulate more genes, or we have a say with more genes and traits than we did with PreImplantation genetic diagnosis.
And there's an interesting, I think, discussion to be had here about a sort of corporate, versus individual decision making. So, and it gets back to this question of who has access to these technologies, and where is the conversation happening about what we value, and there isn't that conversation happening in a broad-based way.
Yes.
Pardon me for a second, but that actually follows under the Icelandic government.
Mm-hmm.
They voted for this.
Well, and that may be, that would be an interesting case to take up, to bring into this mix. I don't know either. I don't know if anybody else.
Well, it's kind of like the notion I was trying to start with, is that we create these institutions, and sometimes when we don't want to question it ourselves, that if we find this authority, that's a valid authority. So if they say that this is okay, we can do this.
Then it must be okay.
And that's kind of, the notion that all this is happening in the confines of a medical experiment,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
It was actually done on, they had a full-on vote about this thing. Like
Right.
the entire country
It sounds like a
voted.
panel for next year. we need for Dawn or Doom, right? Because I think we don't have the expertise up here, but it sounds like a really fascinating case. Thank you.
Thank you.
Go this way.
Okay, so when I was reading this novel, I was thinking about J. Marion Sims. He's the father of modern gynecology,
Yes.
and he essentially, tortured Black women in order to, make the strives and his research because he didn't think that Black women felt pain. And even though he did all that, Black women still die in childbirth, like many times more than the national average. And I was thinking about Dr. Bross, what you said, like who benefits from these, eugenics? Who benefits from CRISPR? Because Black women, people who were sacrificed for science, but they're still dying for no reason. So I just had a question, if you want to answer that.
So certainly the people who would benefit from modern eugenics, if you want to call it, are people of privilege. So that's the difference between 100 years ago, eugenics was performed on people, people in poverty, people with disabilities, sort of these minority groups, right? And today, because gene editing is so expensive and genetic testing, is very expensive, it's really considered a privilege. I would say that's the main distinction between eugenics then and eugenics now, or gene editing now.
I want to come back too to something that you raised earlier, which is also that even though maybe the outcomes of these experimentations are open theoretically to everybody now, what we learn is that not all are able to take advantage of it because of the deep held suspicion now of these kinds of institutional experimentations. So there's also, I guess one of the things that I care about so much about this format and this panel is that we're reminded always that technology and science don't exist in a vacuum, and that culture and society matter. And they matter for who does what and who can take advantage of what and who suffers in the process. Thank you. We'll go back and forth maybe next one.
This question goes out to any one of you that are interested in answering. I believe it was one of you that described the book as historical fiction or something along those lines. I'm going to be referring to the chapter on North Carolina primarily for this question. But in some cases it is taken out of proportion. They combine historical travesties and put them into one event, as was done in the chapter based on North Carolina. And my question is, in what capacity would you say that would be good for other scenarios? Because there is a lot of other racial travesties that have happened, obviously in the history of mankind. Would you say that would be a good approach if you're going to be writing about other examples of that sort of thing?
A good approach if you're going to be writing about other examples in the book, to be thinking about the ways in which, if I understand your question, to be thinking about the ways in which there's a kind of merging of history with fiction and the parallels or kind of the layering over of historical events on top of each other within each chapter. Would that be a good approach? Is that what you're asking? Yeah, yes. For analyzing the book is what I'm understanding you're asking.
Yeah, that and in other scenarios.
In other scenarios beyond beyond this. Okay, this work.
I think I just offer one thing, and think of all the classes you've taken, and there can be a wide range of different subject matters. But typically, the courses you walk away remembering something and absorbing something is when the professor, the instructor, teaches through stories, right? And because I think we start to immerse ourselves in the story. So you could take all those facts and you could read them, and you can dismiss it. Well, that was in 1870. That's not me. That's irrelevant to me. But when you started putting themselves as characters in a story, and you start building a sympathy or hatred even towards a particular character, now you start, I think, to see the story. So that's why I think reading's so powerful, and that's why reading's so important to what we do and what we become. I agree entirely with you. I think it's a wonderful mechanism to bring the stories to life. Thank you.
I'll just say one word for the doom scenario, though, of literary technique here, which is, I guess I'd feel remiss if I didn't sort of also think about the ways in which narrating history needs to be done rigorously.
Yes.
because it's really easy to take a historical event, fictionalize it, and do damage to our understanding of that. So I wouldn't want to say all stories are equally valid, and I know you're not saying that. All stories are equally valid.
Actually, so.
So doom.
Well, all stories are potentially powerful.
That I agree with, yeah. And so I think it again, it behooves us to take a work like this. I mean, you said it was a hard book to read, and it is a hard book to read. And I definitely know many friends and colleagues and students who say, I just want to be entertained. I don't want to read books that are this difficult.
That's it entirely. Yeah.
And I think, but by the same token, if I eat my Halloween candy every single day for the next month and a half, I'm going to be sick. I'm close to that now. But so every now and then you've got to have some protein. And I think that a book like this can function in that way. But let's have another question.
So my name is Chanel Beebe. I'm a graduate student in engineering education. PhD candidate in engineering education, master's student in industrial engineering, but I'm also an artist and a poet and an educator, so I understand the value of stories. I also have a very critical priority for the stories we tell and the way those narratives go. And I think you all made a good point about how this book takes a very nebulous situation and puts it into a story, because the first way you learn anything is through stories. You learn language through stories. Your life is essentially a story that you understand. And I agree that can be very powerful. I think the issue we run into is that though we know, like with candy, if you eat that for the next week, you get sick. With negative stories, the sickness isn't felt immediately, and it isn't felt to you personally, right? So if we take the Iceland example that the student in the back gave, that was voted upon, right? So there were people within their community who had digested this story repeatedly, that the value of somebody with Down syndrome is not important, like that the existence of somebody with Down syndrome doesn't really matter. So I think this kind of echoes the idea that the types of stories we tell matter, but also the types of education that students experience and that families replicate control the way that individuals get to act, especially once they get into these institutions. Because I think we talk about institutions and we talk about academia, we talk about technology as if they're these objects that make decisions, when in reality there are people who are making these decisions, there are people who are coding these things, there are people who are voting, who are killing babies in Iceland and those kind of things. But those people had a teacher at some point, and that teacher had a value system that went unchecked. And I think as educators and as students and as people who have the intellectual capita to be having this conversation at a distance and who are not Cora, who are not seeing our babies being taken away, who are not victims of the civilist experience, we have this privilege of kind of intellectualizing this space. But I think that privilege comes with the obligation to be very intentional about the stories that we value and the experiences that we understand. And I think the only way to really do that is to connect ourselves with other versions of lives that are not experienced the same way. Because I think the only reason that we're talking about DNA and eugenics and stuff like that is because there's this conception that only certain types of lived experiences are valid, right? Or that certain types of suffering just need to go away, that it's the issue of the person who has the issue and not the issue of the environment, right? But if you have a flower that dies in the room, you don't kill the flower, you just put it in a different room, right? So I think there's something about our environment that we haven't really been critical about. And I think as people in this room, it's evident that we have some type of social, there are 8 different types of capita. So we have some type of social and intellectual capita that I think we often like to off-put into our professions or off-put into, intellectualizing it in terms of these stories. But there's some real action that needs to be taken for that hope to matter, right? Because resilience is not just resilience if you just believe it, but it's if you keep showing up every day and if you keep doing something differently. So I don't really have a question, but that was kind of the way
you've answered you've answered the third question, which is we see things in this passage, we ask questions about it, what do we do?
Yeah, and I think there's a personal responsibility that is difficult because you have to reflect, okay, within my space, what could I actually be doing, right? And as a person who prefers, I don't like reading, right? I don't even like the fact that I'm an engineer, but I know that capita means that I know some things and I can translate things that other people can't. So I take that as a responsibility. Not to say that everyone should, but that there's something within your wheelhouse, within your skill set that can be translated for these things.
I guess I just offer one thing, and you heard Zahra early on speak. She speaks as a biologist, but she's very quick to bring in the importance of bringing in ethics and other disciplinary. And if there's a concern of a university today, and this is worldwide, is that increasingly we become specialists in narrower and narrower and narrower fields. And I mean, I think that's exactly, so how do you, really, I think where do we bring the depth or the breadth in our education so when you encounter a particular situation, you can actually question it. So.
Thank you.
I heard
someone on the panel say that one of the things we might want to do is, in regards to gene editing, is slow things down, get a discussion between. I don't think that's possible. And the reason for that is humans learn and explore as much as we can, as fast as we can. I don't think there's ever been an example in history where we have successfully slowed a technological exploration down. A case in point I would raise would be like the Bush administration illegalized certain types of stem cell research. Okay, other countries did the research if it was illegal here. Look at the war on drugs, where we've illegalized the exploration of people into their own consciousness or mind alter. You can't stop it. So with that in mind, how do we get ahead of the technology? How do we have the social discourse, the social exploration, the social processes, and the social structure to ensure that the technology is not dragging us forward, but we're ahead of the technology socially? And the only thing I can think of is we have got to redouble our efforts and be incredibly intentional about this. Because if we're just laissez-faire and, oh, we're going to learn stuff and we'll figure it out as we go, we're going to get more of what we already have. But if we actually put in the structures in place where we do the exploration, the discourse, the agreement between the legislature and the electorate, then there's a possibility we can bring some sanity to our technological exploration. Just my 2 cents.
No, that's great. Agree.
Do you want to speak as an economist on that one? I kept thinking the economists should be weighing in too in terms of how to.
Oh, well, I mean, all disciplines. I mean,
Yeah.
I don't think you can leave it to any one particular voice. I mean, that's exactly what you're saying. I mean, but if there is, you spoke to the social aspect of this broad conversation around the subject, but when we look at, let's look what the federal government wants to support for research, right? I mean, if you're STEM, and that's what we're doing in our high schools. Be STEM, be STEM, be STEM. Well, but STEM can't stand, right? You can have a STEM and you won't get a flower if you just have a STEM. So I'll leave it at that.
Thank you.
I think it's my turn. I think I've reframed my question about 3 times as I've been waiting in line, but unless our high school students have tuned out on us, it's ironic a little bit that today is Election Day. And should we forget history? This took place somewhere in the middle 1800s. Fast forward 100 years to 1945 and what was happening under the same smooth talk about this is good for the population. Hitler was telling all of Europe that this was good. What would you say to these young people who will be voting on the laws that will control much of this technology? They'll have to fight through the smooth talking, all of the things that sound good in the sense of science for the betterment. What do you say to them? Because they'll be voting long after we're gone.
Anybody want to tackle that one? Just a small question. Thanks for that. We can take care of that in about 30 seconds, I think.
Well, I mean, the important thing you said, Joyce, is we need to question. We need to allow ourselves to question and just not accept. And if there's, and I'll go back, I mean, when Chris introduced me, she introduced me as an avid reader. I read almost anything I can get my hands on. But part of reading, and I mean, the problem is now a lot of our reading, I'm guessing, Joyce, you grew up reading newspapers, right? And there was a time when there was this profession called journalism, and it was really a venerated profession. And we relied upon, there was a phrase when I grew up, you said I read it in the news, but you believed it. Because you trusted that the journalistic profession had a sense of ethics and responsibility, and they would. Now, that may not always be true, right? We know in retrospect. But at the end of the day, now, when my news is coming from something that's been retweeted 45,000 times, I don't know that number 45,000 indicates any validity in the statement. So I think what's important, and speaking to the audience you are, but it's true for you and I as well, is that we've got to do a better job of questioning, is what you said true? And calling people when they just blatantly tell lies. And I don't know how we can get to this, you go back to the importance of the social discourse. But when we allow people just to say stuff and they're not challenged on it, how can you have a discourse? So.
Yeah, I would agree. And at the risk of, I think I sort of referenced an answer earlier in one of my previous comments, but to extent, and that was this idea of not sort of resting easy, right? Cora has the risk of resting easy in South Carolina, and eventually she moves on. Another way I can answer the question and also connect it to the narrative, the larger narrative of this novel, is to remind you that one of the things that Cora, and this connects to what you said as well about literacy, one of the things that Cora and all of the slaves like her were refused was literacy. And it becomes the thing that she is engaged in as she moves from one location to the next. If she can get her hand on a book, she holds it, it's precious, and then at some point she has an entire library, which of course gets burned down. We don't want to forget the doom of that. But the idea is that you're going to be encountering all kinds of resistances along whatever the journey that you're taking to become more self-aware, to become a critical thinker, but you must persist. That literacy needs to be one that's really, really treasured in much the same way that Cora treasures it. And so I think your comment about being very careful about how you interpret anything that you read and being, really committed to that kind of engagement is important, so that as you move forward, as you're making decisions about what it means to be a responsible and ethical and moral citizen in your society, that you're coming with the full picture and not a kind of propaganda. Know the difference between propaganda and real information, and know how to make sense of that for yourself and treasure it like Cora did. So.
And protect it.
Do you want to add
And
anything,
protect it. And know that it will be challenged. Again, that's that will always be a struggle. So you have to kind of get in for the long fight here.
I keep checking my watch, and I'm sorry to be doing it, but I know that we've got panels coming, and we've only got about 2 minutes left. I think we just have time for one more question, and I cannot remember which. Are we there? I'm so sorry. But I will say, we can hang out for a little bit afterward if you want to come and ask a question directly. Thank you.
My question, as an avid reader, I believe you learn something, and each reader has their own independent learning that they obtain from a text. My question for each of you is, what is that one item that you felt you learned and will continue to carry on through your life through reading this book?
Oh, that's a deep.
2 minutes or less.
Again, yeah, quick question. We can solve it all.
Well, Ridgway is a kind of example. That character, he represents that propaganda, that very dangerous. There's a way that he repeats his idea of sort of, American expansionism and all the stuff that goes with that. The takeaway is that Cora beat Ridgway. In the end, and her journey is not over yet, but that it's possible that you can actually fight that and win. And that's under 2 minutes response, sorry.
Interview?
Yeah, I second that. Persistent wins.
Persistence wins.
Yeah, persistence is part of grit. So yeah. I'll go exactly with perseverance, persistence, the importance. I like that. It's a good end. Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, unless we end on too dawn of a note, I'll just say maybe a little bit of my takeaway. We started this out by saying that Indiana was the first state to pass the eugenics law in 1907, and it persisted on the books until 1974. So there's a different kind of persistence. Over 2,500 people in the state of Indiana were sterilized, forced, coerced, some perhaps willingly, but 2,500 people. And in 2007, on the anniversary of the passing of the law, the state passed a resolution of apology, a concurrent resolution of apology. And to be honest, there's very little information out there about this resolution. I called the State Historical Society to confirm that it was indeed passed, and they could not confirm because they don't keep records of that. But I'll give you the language here. And I think the ending of it is especially important in section 2, that they passed this resolution in hopes that the citizens of Indiana become familiar with the history of the eugenics movement and the belief that a more educated and enlightened population will repudiate, there's a verb I want to keep in mind, the many laws passed in the name of eugenics and reject any such laws or technologies in the future, perhaps. I'll leave it with that. I want to say thank you to Emma, who's been illustrating our panel. If you've not seen this yet, I think it's amazing to watch. Thank you all very much for your questions, and let's thank our panelists. Thank you. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you. This is wonderful.
One last announcement. The Purdue English Department will welcome the author of this book, Colson Whitehead, to campus on April 11th as the keynote speaker for our literary awards. He will be doing a free and open to the public reading at 8 p.m. that evening, again on April 11th. And we invite you to come and see him talk about this book and talk about his literary vision. Thank you, everybody.